Uh, um, this comes out of work that I did in a maximum security prison in Maryland called the Maryland Penitentiary. And I come from a background of phenomenology, philosophical phenomenology. And I want to talk a little bit about why it is I went into a prison and got very interested in working with the inmates and the import of our work together, both sociologically and also phenomenologically, or at least the backdrop to it. First of all, I'm an American. I hail from Baltimore, Maryland. And in America, I don't really know if there's any comparable phenomenon going on in Canada, but I doubt it. But in America, we have really soaring incarceration rates in the last 20 or 30 years. For example, if you go back 30 years ago, 1972, there were about 300,000 Americans in prison. If you fast forward to 2002, there are over 2 million Americans in prison. So an increase between 6 and 7-fold during that period of time. And America has about 5% of the world's population, but it has about 25% of the world's prisoners. We incarcerate at rates about 6 to 10 times that of other comparable Western countries, which I hope Canada is an example of. So we have more prisoners in a single state, the state of California or the state of Texas, choose either one, than do the countries of France, Germany, Great Britain, Japan, the Netherlands, Singapore, all put together. We have more prisoners in a single state. So the United States has embarked on a kind of unique social experiment, which is to, whatever the problem may be, certain kinds of juvenile delinquency or certain kinds of mental illness or drug addiction or property crimes, whatever the problem might be, there's really one solution that is offered and applied, which is simply to put people into cages. And in America, this very disproportionately hits the minority populations. African Americans, for example, are about 13% of all Americans, but about 46% of prisoners, nearly half of prisoners. African Americans and Hispanics are 63% of the people in prison in America. Nearly 2/3 are African American and Hispanic. So sociologically, there's a great deal of import to really kind of looking at the situation, the life world, the experience of these men and women in prison, and just kind of making their voices present among us. Because obviously when someone is imprisoned, one of the things it does is it takes their body, it takes their mind, it takes their voice out of the larger society and effectively silences them. So one thing we'll be doing today is trying to listen to the voice of these prisoners, and I'll be reading some of their words and even showing images of some of the men who I worked with and making them present here among us. Also, I do think that it's not only sociologically and politically important to think about these issues, but also phenomenologically important. Because I hate to put it this way, this sounds a little more callous than I think is in my heart, but it's quite a research experiment, so to speak, to look at human beings and to see what happens to their experience of their body, their experience of space, their experience of time, their experience of community when they're confined. For example, the average cell might be about the size of a bathroom, that one of us has in our own home. When you're confined in that kind of setting for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, what happens to the human experience? And I want to discuss that with a special attention to the dynamics of power, because obviously the situation of confinement has a lot to do with the state exercising its power over people who have abused their power. And mainly I dealt with very serious and violent criminals. And conversely, the inmates, as they cope with this kind of situation of extreme confinement, are also trying to reassert a sort of power to escape or to reclaim and redeem the environment in which they find themselves. So in this work, I'll be using things like Heidegger's analysis of the life world, Merleau-Ponty's analysis of the human being's relationship to their lived body, and also Michel Foucault's analysis of power and how different vectors of power kind of intermingle and conflict with one another. The voices I will be using do come directly from men who I worked with in the prison. And I've actually quoted excerpts from this book that Bob mentioned, The Soul Knows No Bars, Inmates Reflect on Life, Death, and Hope. And just to give you a little bit of background, these are men in a maximum security prison, primarily murderers, although there also was one person in for big-time drug dealing, one person in for rape. But most of them are serving life sentences and beyond, whatever that means. One of them had double life, plus 20. And he cheated the state by dying in his mid-40s. He would have appreciated that because he used to sort of joke about this, what the state was asking of him when they sentenced him to 2 lifetimes plus 20 years. These men were relatively well educated. To get into my class, you had to be college level or beyond. And most of them had earned their degrees through college extension programs that were available in the early 90s that have been closed since then in the United States, and I'll talk about that a little later. They're primarily African American, because Baltimore is a majority African American city, plus I talked about the vectoring of minorities in prison. And maybe I'll just start by putting up a couple of images. This is the prison, Maryland State Penitentiary. Looks sort of, I don't know, foreboding, doesn't it? Kind of gothic. It's actually the world's oldest continuously operating penitentiary. And when I call it a penitentiary, this has to do with the so-called penitentiary movement that began in the 1770s. And I'll talk about a little bit later, but this is the oldest example, which it first opened its doors in 1811, but then of course it first closed its doors in 1811 also. Not sure what the right expression is. And this is a brief sort of overview of myself and many members of the class. Anyway, let's start looking at some of this phenomenological material. And I'll say a few words, and I'll let the prisoners say a few words. First thing I want to talk about is lived time. Husserl and Heidegger and other continental philosophers have made a distinction, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, between a kind of lived time and the sort of clock and calendar time that we measure with our technological instruments. You might say the latter is based on the kind of Newtonian notion of time as something that flows equably, independent of observers, is susceptible to mathematical measurement, so-called absolute time. And by way of contrast to that, lived time is experienced in a highly variable way. Heidegger said that in a funny way, the future comes before the present, before the past. In other words, our future goals kind of organize our present and structure it, and even sort of our interpretation of the past. So time does not simply flow equably from past to present to future. It sort of bends back upon itself. Also, as we know, time can slow down and speed up. If you're really sort of bored by this lecture, time is probably creeping by very slowly. No? Okay. I'm a little reassured. But once you start watching the clock, the minute hand sort of comes to a halt, and you can't make it move forward. And conversely, when you're absorbed in a really powerful or enjoyable experience, the time sort of zooms by, and you say, I don't know where the day went. So we do have this experience of time as very, very variable. And in a broader sense, the lived time of our life has sort of overarching rhythms and themes. The time of the day as we wake up and have our breakfast and get washed up and go into work, the 9 to 5 time, the evenings, the weekends, the special holidays and holy days that we celebrate, all give our life a kind of rhythm and larger harmony. The summer versus the school year, if you're a teacher or whatever. And for people who live on the, kind of life on the street in an inner city environment, as many of the men I worked with did, you already have some ruptures and alterations of the kind of time we might experience. You have people who are in a situation of chronic unemployment, often family disruption, sometimes selling or addicted to drugs. Sometimes there's a kind of despair that has settled over things and cut off one's vision of the future. So you already have some alterations of that lived time, but it's still a life. It's still a rich and rhythmed and measured life. What happens, though, when you're thrown into prison? Imagine yourself standing in front of the docket, and the judge says, 20 years or 30 years. They pronounce sentence upon you, and that sentence is put in terms of time. Think about the sudden change in the very meaning of time. That 20 years no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the state. It is time that you must serve, as opposed to time, in some ways, serving you. This will be translated on the daily basis into constant reminders that your time is no longer your own. Here's when you will wake up. Here's when you will have 45 minutes in the yard. Here's where you will report for your count out or report for your meal, whatever. Time has basically been ripped away from you. A lot of things can happen as the result of that. I hear prisoners sometimes brooding over the past, kind of the regret at the wrong turn their life has taken. Prisoners experiencing the present as kind of coming to a halt. There's not very much to do. There's not very much to fill up that day for many inmates, so the time creeps slowly. Beyond that, Minkowski, a phenomenologist, talks about two different ways to live toward the future. One of them he calls activity. This is sort of the Heideggerian notion that our present is structured by our future goals. You know, the book we're trying to write, the vacation we're planning, the whatever. But Minkowski says in certain situations that can reverse into what he calls expectation, where instead of you purposively advancing toward the future, you feel as if you're frozen in place waiting for the future to come toward you because there's some expected event that you must await. I remember I used to feel this way about big sports events. I'd get so excited about the Super Bowl when I was 12, but I'd have to wait 4 days until it came to me, and it would be very difficult. And in a much more serious vein, you can imagine the position of the inmate who is awaiting their date of release 17 years from now, and then 15 years from now, and then 12 years from now. The life and energy can be drained out of the present as you live in this expectation of a future that you can really do nothing to bring toward you and accelerate, especially if opportunities for parole are being cut off, as they have been throughout the United States. So how do individuals respond to this past as a scene of regret, this present as vacated, this future as lived in expectation? Let's listen to the voice of some of these men. Donald Thompson, he was doing pretty well until his father was murdered when he was 12, began to turn to a life of crime, has a lot of pain within him, asked me if I could help him get a therapist so he could work it out, and we were unable to make that happen. Kind of sad to me. Really good guy, but he knew he had inner demons and wanted assistance in processing them and was not able to find it within the system. There's a handout so we can follow along with these words. Sure, if you're willing. Thanks. Donald says, I think the problem is that guys in here spend most of the time just discussing the good old days, the glory days. When I had my car, these 2 jobs, these 5 girls, or when prison was better, or instead of knives and machine guns, we had 45 Magnums. If you try to talk about the future, it's just not acceptable. Selvin, he's up next. He was sort of a hardcore black nationalist who's kind of mellowed over the years and was quite welcoming to myself as a white teacher. Selvin said, I've seen guys with a couple of life sentences plus some numbers behind it saying, yeah, my wife will be waiting for me like the old days. I'd be thinking, are you out of your mind? I wouldn't say it because they'd be ready to fight, but they're trapped in the past. John Woodland, son of a dentist, had just finished a BA at Morgan State University where my wife teaches when he was incarcerated for murder. He got involved in the drug trade to put away money for law school. He'd already been accepted to law school. And when I mentioned that a lot of these people are murderers, most of it was in connection with the drug trade, kind of heroin and that kind of stuff, big in Baltimore. John says, quite a few guys try to live in the past. I like living in the future, thinking about what my life is going to be. But I think one thing most of us try to avoid is the present, because the present here is the most painful. Let me just pause and call this strategy that we're hearing voiced, the strategy of escape. The people who are, kind of trapped in a painful present are seeking to escape into the past or into the future. This can be very kind of sterile and self-destructive. Like Selvins thinking, these guys are out of their mind, living in the past. But it doesn't always have to be sterile or destructive. John is talking about thinking about what his life is going to be like, and obviously this gives him some hope and some purpose. Heidegger talks about the structure of time as involving a series of ecstasies, which literally means to stand outside of itself. So someone who is in prison can really stand outside of their present suffering and use the ecstatic movement of time to widen and liberate their awareness. Let's resume this discussion with Q, an alias. This is the one person who has gotten out of prison and is still alive. He chose to have his name removed from the book. He says, I see it a little differently. To me, time is like a dragon I have to slay. If I can master the present, I will have used my time to redeem time. Then I can go back and offer something to people who never had to be in that situation. I get up in the morning at 8:30, and I don't get back to my cell until about 10 p.m. Between those times, I'm constantly involved in activities that are beneficial in what I want to do. I'm reading materials I intend to use in the future for political work and philosophical literature, concentrating heavily. The time flies for me, Sometimes I can't even find enough hours to complete where I want it. He's actually back in Nigeria now, where he came from originally, and hopefully doing good work there. Wayne Brown, who is a Christian minister, earned that degree while in prison, a divinity degree, said, I call this doing time when you use every available moment for your benefit. When you have time to sit back and mope and worry, that's when time begins to do you. So in contrast to the strategy of escape we heard earlier, I would call this the strategy of reclamation. That somehow these gentlemen are talking about in the present, how can it be reclaimed as a scene for fulfilling and meaningful action? How can you do time instead of having time do you? How can you reclaim the meaning and richness of time? Moreover, I guess I want to say that though I'm first kind of structuring these as opposites, kind of escaping the present versus reclaiming and redeeming it, a lot of the inmates I know are balancing both of them, and sort of like in a yin-yang polarity, the seeds of one within the other. We hear Q talking about how he's redeeming the present, but as part of his vision for what he wants to accomplish in the future. And when you really put the two together in that fashion, I'm going to use a third term. I'll call that integration, the blending of escape and reclamation. I choose that term from the Latin integratus, which means renewal or made whole. And I think we hear in something like what Q says, somebody who is at least working in integrating time, integrating the present and the future, integrating the self, and integrating his world into a meaningful whole. Now, the fact is, it's very hard to do this in prison. I was kind of working with some exceptional individuals. For example, Q talks about, the reading he was doing, his intellectual labors. at least in America, about 70% of inmates are functionally illiterate. Incredible statistics, 70%. I mentioned that the prison college programs have been closed throughout the country. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Prison libraries are extremely underfunded, with prisoners having restricted access to it. If you try to send books into prisoners, which I have done, sometimes they're rejected because they're not sent directly from the publisher and they're deemed a security hazard. Sometimes prisoners are allowed to have only a very limited number of books in their possession because it's deemed a fire hazard. Books have to be passed by censoring authorities. Any kind of religious material has to be approved by the chaplain in some prisons. So there just are all these structures that make this work of integration very difficult to do. I don't want to make it sound like, prison is just a wonderful place to get yourself together. One thing I'll say in closing about lived time is just, though I'm talking about prison, and that may be far from your own professional interest or, service interest or whatever, I think we're also beginning to learn a lot about human beings in general and how human beings react to experiences of extreme constriction. Someone who's sick, someone who's struggling with multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis or cancer, someone who's living in an inner city environment constricted by extreme poverty and limitation of life opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. You can imagine using many of the same strategies of escape, whether through drug use or fantasy or whatever, or reclamation or integration, but they're the same kind of problems are posed and the same kind of strategies are implemented. Let's take a look at this material in relation to space. In a way, the discussion is rather symmetrical, so I'll try to move through it quickly. Just as Newton talked about an absolute time, he talked about an absolute space. Descartes came along and showed how that could be plotted according to the Cartesian axes. So once again, we have this notion of a kind of thing, an absolute sort of, but contentless container that stretches equably in all directions, that can be mathematically measured, etc. We tend to often, at least in the West, structure our environment in harmony with that, this kind of a highly geometrical room, as opposed to the classical Chinese garden I visited yesterday, is a very geometrical reading of the universe, as opposed to one profoundly based on the spatiality of the natural world. But if we look at the life world, once again, it's much more nuanced, centered and regionalized, given rhythms and vectors by the components of our life. We live in a home that in turn is nested within a larger community. We have our place of work, our place of vacation. We have other cities and other people we're connected to at great distances. Even our body has vectored space into the near and the far, the front and the back, the left and the right, the up and the down. So lived spatiality is profoundly vectored into different and meaningful places. Now, once again, when you get thrown into prison, And the judge says 20 years. Though that's a temporal sentence, it's also a spatial sentence. What does it mean? It means for 20 years, you will be confined within a very small space chosen by the court system, and access to your family, your home, your community, your neighborhood, travel, the outside world will be denied to you. So you will be ripped out of the texture of lived space that you've been inhabiting. In its place, the space you will be given is really a weird one. Here are a few characteristics I came up with. It's a constricted space. I don't really need to say much about that, but it's constricted to a cell, and then a tier, a building, a yard, period. It's a ruptured space. You know, if I want to see what's happening the next room over, I just go out this door and go in that door. And a few people have already chosen to do that. But if you were in prison, you know, your heres are radically severed from your theirs. You know, famous prison, Alcatraz in San Francisco, they used to talk about how the prisoners would be on this little island, San Francisco Bay, and hear the sounds of the city and see the lights. But of course, they could never get to that, and no one ever successfully escaped from Alcatraz. You may have a buddy who's there in your cell, suddenly they're transferred over into the other tier, and for security reasons, tier A and tier B have no contact with one another. So you're constantly living with a whole variety of ruptures in your lived space. The space is also radically disoriented. All the things that would orient your normal inhabitating of space are not particularly acknowledged by the prison system. In a way, once again, it's a geometrical construct, technological construct for security purposes. And not only does it not really present you with an inviting life world, but it doesn't harmonize with the natural surroundings in which it's set. You know, you might have a beautiful prison outside of Vancouver, but there'll be no relationship between the prison and the natural world. The people within it will essentially be cut off from nature, except for a patch of dirt in the yard or, you know, little scraggly tree. At least that's how it would be in America. And in many ways, this spatiality has the meanings kind of bizarrely reversed. You know, if you go to your home, you have a key. Nobody else does. In prison, it's the opposite. You know, the guards have the key. You don't. You may have a beautiful picture window and look over, you know, the mountains. In this case, there's a picture window so people can look in and see you. Your home keeps you private. Nobody else can invade it. Well, when you're incarcerated with prison, you're surrounded by hundreds of other dangerous criminals, and you have no privacy. And the guards can come in at any time. So the customary meanings of home, you know, security, privacy, personal expression, etc., are all taken away and reversed when your home becomes a prison. So once again, the question is, how do prisoners deal with this? What does the human body and the human spirit do in the face of these kinds of radical challenges? Boy, you're good. I didn't even say anything. And we have John Woodland once again. So I'm going to read a few quotes. John says, "We always had a concept around here about keeping yourself distant from prison activities and the prison mentality. Don't participate in a whole bunch of prison groups. Don't get caught up in playing football, basketball. Don't think about fixing no cell up to make it comfortable. Let it stay raggedy. You want to keep a mindset that this is not some place for me to get comfortable. Michael Green says, and he's the next, I agree. I got a friend that every cell he moves in, he paints to the max. I refuse to paint one of those cells up like it was home. To me, it's just a place where you exist. Charles, who's a Muslim imam, says, I understand what Mike's saying because I'm one of those dudes. I call my cell my palace. As a matter of fact, I just got it painted last week and I paid the dude 4 packs to do it. He painted the floors, my ceiling, the whole thing. I got my oriental rugs laid down. I don't care where I'm at. I'm going to make it a heaven while I'm there. Even in this hellhole, I'm going to find some heaven. And he continues on, a couple more quotes. He says, the cells where you actually get your schoolwork done, or the work for organizations you're in, or work to get out of prison, man is created from one cell, right? And as man grows, he adapts into another cell. And that cell is also a place for growth and development. When you read the Quran and the Bible, you'll find that different prophets went to the cave for comfort and isolation. And the cells like that cave. And Trey, very brilliant young man, father was killed when he was 1 year old, mother was drug addicted. Says, my space ain't too restricted because I think of myself as on an odyssey. Even in here, I don't look at this as my home. It's just an experience that's necessary in order for me to get where I'm going. I believe I'm here because I lost my road. That's what I'm searching around for, the road to the larger society. In the meanwhile, I'm supposed to be restricted in space. I take the Stoic outlook. My space is supposed to be restricted, but my ideas don't have to be. That's where I find all my freedom. When I was on the street, I had less space than I do in prison. I would only associate with the criminal elements. Since I've been in prison, I've met people with sophistication, people from different races. We meet here. We get a chance to rest, get out of the immediate world, and we can think about things we couldn't on the street. So I won't go into this in detail, but you see once again some people talking about escape. Don't make this your home. Other people talking about reclamation. I'm going to paint up my cell and make it a heaven, even if it's a hellhole. And some people who are also talking in a profound way about integration, how to take the very situation of confinement and turn it into a provocation and an opportunity for liberation, for expansion of soul. Yes? The views about using it or not getting home there. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's a sort of syndrome among prisoners that if you get too comfortable, you never get out, or as soon as you get out, you engineer it to be thrown back into prison, and it can be a real dead end. And thank you for your comment. Appreciate that. One of the interesting things, and I just want to close on this note and do leave some time for questions and discussion, as this gentleman has already initiated. I think what the inmates are doing in this kind of integrative work is they're harking back to the original inspiration behind the penitentiary. Maybe I'll put up that photo again of the Maryland Penitentiary. Once again, this was a movement that began back in the 1770s. It was led by Quakers. I'm a Quaker, So I bear some of the collective guilt for this idea we had. But the idea was actually to rehumanize and even re-spiritualize criminal justice. It wasn't the harsh conditions of today's penitentiaries. It was really modeled on a monastic ideal. The term penitentiary has to do with the penitential work that monks did. The prison cell is modeled on the monastic cell. The word cell is from the Latin word for heaven, caelum, like celestial. Because the notion was in your cell, you would do a kind of inner work whereby you clean up your soul, you are penitent for your sins, you draw close to God, and you go through a radical reformation. We still talk about the reformatory system, the correctional system, so we still have this idea in our language. And we see some of the prisoners really accomplishing this. You know, talking about how they're going to use this situation of profound confinement as a kind of, you know, way to revolutionize their spirit, their soul. Gandhi, we heard Dr. Gandhi on the first day. Mohandas Gandhi used to call Yeravda prison, in which he served much time thanks to the British government. He used to call it Yeravda Temple. You know, he said, basically, what I do in here is the same as what I would do in my temple. I pray, I meditate, I write letters. I'm going to use this as my monastic cell. And some of the inmates are doing that. The sad thing to me is, you know, so many people are in prison that really shouldn't be there. And then once they're there, they're given so little assistance to use the prison in this kind of a correctional way. Conditions are very overcrowded. Inmates are treated in a very dehumanized and demeaning fashion by the authorities. Opportunities for education, for therapy, for occupational training are very limited. I've mentioned that, for example, in 1993, the American Omnibus Crime Bill, supported by Republican lawmakers, but also signed into law by President Clinton, took away from inmates the right to use Pell Grants, which fund higher education for low-income Americans. Up until that point, prisoners could use those funds because they have no income. And this enabled there to be college extension programs in prisons around the country, which radically seemed to lower the recidivism rate for inmates. They do much better when they get out. But these college programs were closed as a result of that 1993 bill. Just to put it in a personal way, the inmates I was working with were transferred out en masse when the nature of the prison I was working with changed, so our class was curtailed. Our governor of our state, who is a moderate Democrat, said that he will not sign off, he will not agree to the parole of any lifer in the Maryland state system, except for medical reasons when they're near death. In other words, even if the parole board says this person has served 30 years, they've had an exemplary record, they've earned a college degree, we recommend parole. The governor has taken a blanket position. I won't put my signature on it. And so far, the courts have supported his right to do that, even though judges sentenced these inmates with the understanding that they would be available for parole after 17 years. Anyway, I could go on with some of the what I think to be horrors. And obviously the upshot is people who are in a kind of brutalizing system tend to be brutalized. And so they may come out angrier, they may come out more dysfunctional, less in touch with the trends of the broader society, the latest technologies. They have the label of ex-con stuck next to their name, which makes it harder to get a job. So it's not surprising that this recidivism rate is so high among inmates. Essentially, remember somebody saying, if you were to ask a mad scientist to concoct a machine to produce criminality, it would look like the contemporary criminal justice system, at least in America. It's so counterproductive. But at the same time, the work I did with inmates was very uplifting and very inspirational, not just sort of deadening and depressing, because of some of the voices that you've heard here. What really is inspiring to me is, even in this situation of tremendous constriction and adversity, the indomitable nature of the human spirit and the way in which people can forge a whole variety of bodily and temporal and spatial and spiritual freedoms, using as their raw materials these kinds of situations of extreme limitation and confinement. Lifers, and I've talked with other teachers who have the same experience, often are much kind of richer to work with than short-timers. Because short-timers already have one foot out on the street, they kind of, they're not going through that kind of inner work that a life sentence opens up for you. So at least the particular men I worked with had not sunk into a pit of despair, but they also were self-selected. They were the ones who chose to take my class, and I'm sure there are many others who are kind of the walking dead. Yes?
My personal experience, I've hardly worked with prison people, and then my stepson went to prison about 10 years ago, threatening me with his gun for breaking an entry. And I was in there, and what I found from my own work with people, it's not just the prison itself, it's that inner condition that keeps in bondage. When he came out, he could never, already before, but he could never totally come out of that. And now he drowned this in February. And it's just that knowing that we are caught in this horrible condition of restriction when we have done evil or when we have done terrible things. And again, we talked about forgiveness with Gandhi. And I love my stepson. And there was just nothing that could have given him that forgiveness, even though we were open to give it to him. And I guess it's that peace in the world where we are not yet able to bring to people that they don't have to feel horrible forever in that which what they've done, because we understand the circumstances that they do it. And so we're just not there yet. So wherever you're confined, you're confined.
Thank you. The original title of this book, by the way, was Getting Out of Prison, and it was based on a comment of one of the inmates who actually became a prize-winning playwright in prison, that if you don't get out of prison while you're in prison, meaning all the inner prisons of rage and ignorance and self-hate and whatever, it doesn't matter when you physically get out of prison, because you're coming back in, or you'll recreate the same life. Yes?
There is an echo of what you're saying in some of these statements here, in the kind of tattoos that the prisoners like to have made on them. Prisons have tattoo shops, as they use some of the electric shavers to make machines to make tattoos. The tattoos that they have, some of the most common, I worked for 4 years in a prison, and they have spider webs. And so I was thinking, what is spider webs? They have them all over their body, and their whole back, because they are in a spider web. They were caught. They have lions. Now the lions could be two things. It could be their kind of instincts, or the way they are fighting with the state. The authorities are the lions against them. And then on the other hand, they have women. Some have the ideal woman, or a woman that they remember. They have them all over with "I love you" or things like that. their mother, and their religious symbol here and there. But very interesting, the things that you were saying about those who were caught in the spiral, or those who were kind of looking beyond the prison experience.
That's interesting.
So
When,
would be a compliment.
yeah. One section of my paper I didn't go into was what happens to your experience of your body. How do you work with and reclaim your body in this situation of extreme bodily confinement? And that's a wonderful example of making your body into this scene of symbolic expressive art. Maybe we can take one more question and then we have to clear out the room very quickly.
Start by the similarity of experience of the prisoners and the experience of children growing up in a family. And really the confinement is the same, and you see the people functionally suffering through it the way the people you mentioned first do through escape, into drugs or whatever, misbehavior or whatever, and the other people living through it and coming out with a pre-med completed, or less by the time they really escape the yoke of parental authority. And you can be a prisoner anywhere. You can be a prisoner without, and I love your story.
Yeah. Thank you very much for everybody.